Dr. Claire Somerville is an executive director of the Gender Center at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Study in Geneva. Claire is an applied medical anthropologist, so we change of discipline, with specialization in gender. And she obtained her PhD from the St. John's College, University of Cambridge in medical anthropology, and a master at the School of Oriental and African Study at the University of London. Claire combines scholarly research in gender and health with practice-oriented knowledge, contributing as expert in international organization, human rights, non-governmental organization, and then other international fora. At the Graduate Institute, Claire heads the Environment, Resource and Sustainability capstone track, and she provided classes in gender and health. And Claire's research is defined by interdisciplinary and multi-sectoral collaboration, and it aims at bridging academic research within industry partnership and clinical science with the intention of bringing academic insight and expertise to current global challenge and vice versa. She regularly engages with dialogue on gender internally and externally. So let's listen now her talk, which is Gendering in STEM, so in technology, engineering, and mathematics science, challenge and opportunity to gender inclusion and diversity in geoscience across sector insight.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you really for inviting me. Daniela has my slides, and she's going to go through them by sharing her screen. But I think I'd like to say at the outset how excited I am to see that you are galvanizing energy together to get together to perform to form this group and to really challenge some of the gender norms and stereotypes that many sectors in academia, but STEM in particular, has found to be challenging. As you said in my introduction, I'm not a geoscientist, I'm a medical anthropologist, but I've spent the last 10 years really focusing on gender, not only in my own discipline, but across a series of sectors. And I think that's what I want to talk to you about today, and I'm going to give you a few examples. So this is a very practical session to begin with. If you could go to the next slide, please, thank you. So I just wanted to outline the context. Now, I'm assuming you're participating here because you're interested in doing something about this, about the gender biases and unconscious bias and sometimes even discrimination that we are aware of in our respective spaces. But I am just going to recap a little bit on some key ideas before launching into a few examples on how we can move the needle on this. And I'm going to first ask, what do we really mean when we think about gender inclusion, and also with that, of course, diversity? And really what I want to get to is what we can learn from an examination of progress in other sectors. Other sectors are making headway in different ways, and we've just heard brilliantly from the SNFS the work that they've been doing. So I think there's a lot of collective knowledge and a collective sharing that we can gain in sessions like this morning. Next slide, please. So why address gender? And I think we're probably all here for the same reason. We're concerned about it, we want to do something, and we have the energy to do something. And really, the sort of barriers and challenges that we face, not only in your discipline, but across all disciplines, really reflect, I think, other wider restricted societal gender norms. And I say it's because we're not alone, and I think sometimes we can feel a bit like we're sort of battling away. And in fact, this is a wider societal, a global issue. And I put that into context by thinking about the history of the women's movements, all the way from suffrage at the early part of the 20th century, late part of the 19th century, to the women's strike, which has become a very important activity for us in Switzerland. Within the other sectors, we've also got a history we can build on here. The Beijing Women's Conference in 1985, of course, is when famously Hillary Clinton stood up and said that women's rights are human rights. And I think we can build on some of these larger movements that have been happening. For the more practical side, I don't think I need to convince you, probably as an audience, the benefits of what looking at gender in our environments can do. You may well be aware of the McKinsey report a few years ago, which proposed the economic arguments. The World Economic Forum also does similar work on trying to calculate how much additional GDP can be got when we seek to look at gender and equalise our environments in which we're working. There is also a lot of performative arguments, and these are suggestive that more gender-inclusive teams actually perform rather better. Even the ILO predicts and puts numbers again to this to suggest that that gender-diverse teams can increase profitability by between 5 and 20% in any organisation or company. The IMF provides similar type data. Probably more important for us as scientists are the innovation arguments and the good science arguments. We know that better gender inclusive teams working together are more likely to get multiple perspectives and be more creative and innovate to create, to think about better research. And I think coming from a medical anthropology perspective and a health centre perspective, it's really just simply good science. When we don't, for example, disaggregate our data, when we don't do some kind of gender analyses of the work we're doing, I think that's just not great science. It's not as rigorous as it could be, and it's not as reliable as it could be. We're missing a whole dimension. So those are some reasons, which is just to clarify and reaffirm the importance of why we need to address gender. Next slide, please. So with that, of course, is also diversity, and I think we can think about that as another dimension of an expansion of what we mean by when we're thinking about looking at gender issues in our field. I think, of course, and this was mentioned in the previous presentation, there are structural issues of discrimination that, of course, are addressed through the legal systems, and which we still occasionally come up against when we work in this field. There's also a notion increasingly of the acceptance of this, that we need diversity. This is part and parcel of working practice. And again, similar to being gender inclusive, the need for diversity is backed up again by the science of the science. So producing better problem solving in diverse groups, better decision making, promoting creativity, avoiding something called group think, which is whereby a group working together who are not diverse or rather similar, start to think in the same way. And as you can imagine, this sort of closes down the opportunities for out of the box thinking of more components. We have not only gender balance and working groups, and diversity in our groups really makes for working environments and better research in the end. Thank you. So this is a little practical step by step, the first steps. And what I'm really thrilled to see that you as a geoscience community have already done the first most important step, which is to collate and analyse your data. And I was really excited to read your report on gender diversity and equality that you have produced from 2003 to 2019. Now, this is absolutely the first step, because without understanding the nature of the gender issues that you are facing in your field, we can't move on. It also becomes a really important baseline from which we can then measure and monitor what it is that we're going to do about it. On the left-hand side there, I've also noted a few other things, like key pointers that I've learned from the last decade of working in this space. One is to not forget that academia, the place in which we work, is a workplace. And with that, there are structures of human resources and governance, which we want to review with a gender lens. And I think we must remember this as well, because we have actually a lot to build on here from other sectors. I think another important element is leadership, finding allies in leadership. This has happened, at least at the Graduate Institute and Geneva more widely, with an initiative, a leadership initiative called the International Gender Champions, which has forced our leaders to sign up to commitments and make commitments which are public and therefore transparent and somewhat accountable. So bringing in our key leaders in our spaces is really important in being able to get the funds, the backing, and the leverage to push things forward. With that, of course, we then begin to be able to identify targets and objectives, and it's really important to set those so that we can at least, as in the previous speaker saying, there are different ways of doing that. Of course, you might want to double the number of women in your field, or you might want to get to a 40% notion, or whatever it is, however you want to calculate it, but setting some objectives and targets becomes really important. Then the next step, of course, is to think about, well, what are we going to do? If we set that target, how are we going to have some corrective measures to try to achieve that target? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in some examples. And finally, it's creating that enabling environment. It isn't just about individual women or even groups of women, but the whole entire environment. So taking a holistic approach to all the different dimensions of the space we're working. Now, in practice, what this looks like is a set of tools. And I sort of named three here because I think these are probably the three key ones that seem to come out of these processes of trying to look at our work environments. First and foremost is a gender and diversity policy. We have to put these things down and share them and have a level playing field upon a consensus around what it is we're talking about. And we need buy-in from the entire community. So a policy that's documented, shared, and will be reviewed and updated in years to come. The next part of that is a gender action plan, and most of your universities will probably have both a policy and a gender action plan, which really puts in place a set of objectives and an implementation plan. We really need that because otherwise we backslide on what it is that the policy might say, and we fail to get to the point of actually making the change we want. And the third component of that, going back to data tracking and monitoring, without which we cannot know if we're progressing. So that's a sort of summary of what I have learned in the sort of key steps and areas of intervention that are really important in these early stages of trying to make some gender transformative change in your area. Next slide, please. So in practice, what this means, I have three examples, or rather three approaches that I would like to run through with you. The first one is really to convince you that, you probably won't be convincing, but change is really actually possible. And I refer to Iris Bohnet, and I will give a few sort of practical comments from her because she's a Swiss professor, for one, she's at Harvard, but she really has pulled together some of the science behind what can be done to change environments, to change behaviours, and to advance gender equality in academia. I'm then going to talk about something I did, since this is a conference meeting, academic scientific meeting, some work that I did in trying to bring a gender perspective to the conference is held every 2 years in Geneva, the Geneva Health Forum. So I'm going to reflect on that. And then I'm going to offer you finally a sort of organisational level example of what another scientific but UN organisation or international organisation, the World Meteorological Organisation, which is I think the closest to the geosciences I could find in the sort of set of examples that I have. So I'm going to walk you through each of those to try to highlight what I think are some of the great lessons learned and great insights from other sectors. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned, Iris Bohnet is a behavioural scientist, behavioural economist, and she has written a book, in fact, which is excellent, highly recommended, called Gender Equality by Design. And her point is really that there are many things that we can do in the way that we design our processes, our systems, our environment, whereby we can de-bias. We can rub away some of the biases and put practices in place that help us to take away the bias that the unconscious bias, to address the unconscious bias that we may have picked up during our lives, that that's just slightly unintended. We don't do it deliberately, intentionally, but the biases that are there as barriers that she's found to the ways in which our systems and organisations work. I think one of the really important things I take away from her is in terms of the academic space, is that so often past performance, and I think this speaks again beautifully to the previous presenter and the work from SNFS, past performance and future potential. Now there is a huge space of gender challenges and opportunities. Typically we are based, our evaluations, or the way our scientific careers are based on what our past performance are, and from that our future potential is evaluated. But in that gap, there are an extraordinarily large number of unintended biases, gender biases. And they run all the way from thinking about what does a typical geoscientist look like? How do they behave? What kind of work would a typical great performer in the future have done in their past? How do they speak? What do they do? Where were they studied? Lots of other factors come into evaluating people with a lot of stereotypes and a lot of unconscious bias based on, that come to the fore in that gap between past performance and future potential. A couple of examples that Iris draws on, which I think you may have already heard of before, but I think are still worth thinking about. The famous one in the 1970s and 1980s was often referred to behind the curtain. So orchestras, large philharmonic orchestras in the US had typically been very biased, or very comprised of mainly men for many years. So during the 70s, they introduced the idea that auditions would happen behind a curtain. So the quality of the person's musical competency would be heard, but not looked at and seen. And this was experimented with to see whether or not there was any unconscious bias that might have been creeping into the evaluation of those who are doing, by those who are sitting in on the audition. And in fact, they found that by putting all participants behind a curtain for their audition, you could increase the chances of women getting selected to the second round of the audition by 50%. The other example she gave, and I think it's one that is very powerful to me, is that when she became Dean of the Kennedy School, we've just gone back, don't worry. When she became Dean of the Kennedy School, she had a look around the corridors and the classrooms and the spaces that they were working in to look at what sort of portraits were on the walls. And what she discovered, that there were 0 of any women. And this is really important, because if you see on the walls of the place in which you're working, you're studying, your knowledge has been created, no one who in any way looks like you, a woman, then your expectation and your role models and your anticipation and the people around you's anticipation might also fall through that gap between past performance and future potential. You don't look like the people on the wall. So one of the first things she did was to change the portraits, and commissioned a lot of portraits by of women who had studied at the Kennedy School, but also important scientists in the field. So I give you these kind of examples from Bohnet, really to be enthusiastic to say that it's possible, and there is a science behind this. And there are plenty of options and opportunities for us to challenge some of these things that we know to be barriers in academia, but everywhere also. Please, the next slide, thank you. So, a very practical example. In 2018, I was in discussions with the organisers of the Geneva Health Forum, a very, very large conference that takes, an international conference with people from around the world that takes place every 2 years in Geneva. We wanted to think about what we could do about the known imbalances in some of the participation and the panels and the content of the conference in previous years. So we did a sort of pilot to see what we could do. So before the conference, we sent out communications to the selection committees to highlight and sensitize their awareness to that we were going to be looking at gender in this particular conference, and for them to take on board an assessment of gender balance within the panels that they were convening, or the assessments they were making of different projects and papers, abstracts that were coming in for the conference. And the one criteria we really wanted to avoid was no manels, no all-male panels. With a conference of over 4,000 participants, we were fairly confident that this could be achieved. Indeed it was. The second step, this is before the conference we took, is that I prepared a tailored thematic for each of the plenary sessions, a gender brief, where I took the topic of the panel discussion, and I did a very rudimentary but very insightful, I think, briefing of what the gender questions in that particular thematic might be. And this really was to inform the participants of the panel, the plenaries, to trigger them to think beyond what it was they were going to say, but just to raise questions that would come from a gender perspective of the topic that they're examining. We also sent instructions round to panel moderators. We asked them to be mindful of the diversity of the questioners when seeking in the Q&A sessions, to be mindful of who they asked to present questions. And we also asked them whether they would keep in mind a gender question if the issue of gender didn't come up at all in the panel. So once the conference began, during the opening plenary, we gave a very short gender intervention to say that and announce that formally we're going to be looking at the ways we could advance a gender lens throughout all of the conference proceedings, and that we asked everyone to reflect on the gender dimension of the work that they're doing or the panels they're listening to, and perhaps propose even questions from the floor. We also had pre-prepared, invited from the floor, pre-planned some questions to each of the panels in case these didn't happen organically. So these were very specific interventions we did. And what I think, if we go to the next slide, what we learned from this is, first and foremost, it was acceptable. And of course, when you start to do these small corrective interventions, your concern is there's going to be a resistance to taking this up. But what we found was a very warm welcome from all the participants of the conference. So a tick for acceptance of this being an intervention that they felt was welcomed and that they could respond to. We also found that doing this work pre-conference was really critical. That it was the work we did before in the setting up and the communications we made with panel conveners and organisers of the conference that became the critical awareness raising element that helped set the tone of the conference. Going back to one of the questions proposed in the introduction from Daniela, myth busting. What it did do, I think very, very successfully, was to show how gender is not all about women, and that we all have gender, and there are gender questions in terms of the thematics and research that are as much about men and non-binary as they are about women. So this really opened up the questions of what we're talking about when we were talking about gender in our conference. I think what was also important is that the conference organisers at the highest level were supportive of this, and that there was leadership from there. And I think that really pivots the tone of the conference by ensuring that there is top-level backing. It gave everybody involved in this process the traction, the power to be empowered to bring this up during the conference. So the other learning is this was quite a simple intervention. It wasn't hard to do. It was mainly about communication. It was possible to do it pre-conference and during the conference. It wasn't costly in any way. However, it's not a game changer, but it was very easy to implement. And not everything is going to be a game changer we do, but if we can make these small interventions, I think we can have very significant butterfly effects. I also have, in case which happened in some panels, discussion of gender didn't arise organically within the panel. But the backup gender question, I think, is the science argument, and this particularly worked in the health conference, is the sex disaggregated data is a backup question. It may be less of a question relevant to the geosciences in terms of some of the work that you do. But sex disaggregating of data, whether it's those conducting the research or the other components where there is other interaction with human beings, is a really important learning. So next slide, thank you. So my next example is the WMO, and I put this here to go through relatively quickly, but just to see what happens when you scale up what I just described in a conference, but you scale it up to an entire organization. So the WMO did something rather similar to you have done at the Geosciences. They started with data in 2013. They did a global survey of all their members on these different domains that I've highlighted here, on everything from employment, recruitment, statistics, communications, monitoring, capacity building, human resources, gender focal points, and service delivery. So a really comprehensive global survey. And what this was really important to do was to set the baseline so that anything that happens subsequently could then be measured against the baseline. Now, you'd probably not be surprised to know that the data reflected rather similar findings to that to the report that some of you have been involved in, the Geosciences. So the bar chart at the bottom shows the percentage of women and the RA1, RA2 are the different regions of the world. So really, if you want to go just to the globally, 33% of women, of people employed in NMHSs, which is the National Meteorological or Hydrology Services of a country, is around 33%. The breakdown with the pie charts helps you to see where those women are, and probably you're not surprised to see that a lot of them are most of them are in the areas we'd expect them to be in terms of administration and support components. And I think there are a couple of, always when you're doing this kind of baseline survey work, a couple of points to really take away. One is, sometimes the data are not where we'd like it to be. For example, this report in 2013 showed that the governing body of the WMO, the global governing body, was 80% men. So not great. But on the other side, and I think we should always highlight good news stories, I think they keep us going, is the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, had an entire all-women team. So 50 professional staff women. So what did WMO do with this? Thank you. WMO, first of all, was a lot about, it was the initial response was a lot about raising awareness, a little similar to the first step in my doing the pilot with the Geneva Health Forum conference. And in fact, the WMO did have a gender mainstreaming policy, but very few people knew about it. So they had launched a whole new communications plan globally to get the policy out there, get it read, and get people to start responding to it. We also made a very significant call for action, and this took its form in various different places, including a conference held in 2014 called the Gender Dimensions of Weather and Climate Services Conference. So these were all activities to galvanise a response, to fundraise, to create a gender focal point network, a toolkit, a web page, a bulletin, lots of different activities that collectively came together just to raise the awareness of what was happening, what the situation was. And really importantly to that, they developed, and I think this is one of the keys to success in this, is a framework for action with key performance indicators. So being able, as you know, have a baseline of data, set yourselves the targets, and be able to measure them over a period of time became a really important part of moving things forward at the WMO. If you can go to the next slide, please. It wasn't just, no, one before that, sorry. Thank you, thanks. So just to sort of think about the fact this is an organisation trying to make organisational level changes, it wasn't just about awareness raising. This slide really just shows the sort of work that goes through on the governance side to ensure these things are sustainable. They're put into places where they are immutable. We can't backslide. So they have a gender action plan. They have resolutions depending on the governance bodies of different organisations. Scientific committees are varied, of course, but all types of governance systems have the space to incorporate within them some gender mainstreaming.
Claire,
so
we're really running late. Could you wrap it up?
Okay. In that case, we could just go to my last slide. Cross-sector learning. I think there is a good case with gender transformative action, and the key step, the first step, is about gathering your data. Systems and organisations really do face unconscious and unconscious biases and challenges, but we can address them. I think really simple interventions can have really quite transformative impact, and they're a component part of moving forward to things like gender action plans and more substantive resolution level, governance level action on gender. And I think really the last point I also want to make is that there are a vast range and mix of measures, from governance to all the different things that I've also mentioned, but also an opportunity for all of us to reflect on the agenda lens through the research we conduct, to develop a gender analysis in the research that we conduct, to open up different spheres of innovation and thinking that we might not have otherwise have thought of. So that's my final slide. So thank you.